The missiles have stopped, the drones have gone quiet. The war is technically over. And somewhere in Tehran, a man in clerical robes is staring at a bank account that used to hold billions and watching the number fall. That image is not a metaphor. It is the most accurate description of what is actually happening inside the Iranian regime right now. And it is the story that almost nobody is telling you loudly enough. Everyone is watching the military front, the blockade, the nuclear negotiations, the IRGC commanders moving pieces around a chessboard. But the most decisive battle being fought in this conflict is not being fought with missiles or drones. It is being fought on a spreadsheet, in a currency market, in the queue outside a bank, and in the underground parking garage of a Tehran shopping mall that was supposed to be a monument to Iranian ambition, and became a monument to everything that has gone wrong. But here is the detail that should stop you cold. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy published an analysis drawing on purported minutes from an internal IRGC commanders meeting with Supreme Leader Khamenei. The document described rank-and-file IRGC soldiers being forced to take multiple jobs just to survive on their salaries. One commander allegedly complained that soldiers stationed on border duty, facing daily threats from armed smugglers, were being paid so little relative to the cost of living that two generals reported their own soldiers had been caught selling intelligence for cash. IRGC soldiers, the regime's shock troops, the men whose loyalty is supposed to stand between the clerical leadership and the streets, selling intelligence for money because their wages do not cover rent. When the men the regime pays to protect it are experiencing the same economic desperation as the people they are supposed to suppress, the system has reached a breaking point that no propaganda can paper over. I'm Flash America, and what I'm about to walk you through is the full picture of Iran's financial collapse. Not the headline inflation numbers, but the banks absorbing catastrophic losses, the clerical families living in London and Dubai, while ordinary Iranians line up for bread, and the central question that haunts every analyst studying this situation right now. When the war ends and the reconstruction bill arrives, can a system built on money survive without it? Let's start where this story actually begins. Not on February 28, 2026, when the first U.S.-Israeli strikes hit, several years earlier. Because the war did not break Iran's economy. It broke an economy that was already on its knees. By the time the missiles started falling, Iran had been running on fumes for years. Sanctions had reduced Iran's oil exports to approximately 1.5 million barrels per day by 2025, less than half of what the country produced before the Trump maximum pressure campaign began in 2018. The rial had been in near continuous freefall. By March 2025, the exchange rate had passed 1 million rials to the US dollar, making the rial at that point the least valuable currency in the world. By December 2025, Time Magazine, Euronews, and Al Monitor were all reporting that Iran was nearing economic collapse, with the rial trading at 1.75 million per dollar, and Iran's own finance minister publicly attributing the collapse to the 12-day war against Israel the previous summer. The IMF's World Economic Outlook, as reported by CNBC in April 2026, estimated that Iran's economy will shrink by 6.1% in 2026, with inflation running at 68.9% for the year. Iran International reported that as of late 2025 and early 2026, average Iranian incomes had contracted to roughly $200 per month. Annual food inflation had soared to 64% by October 2025, and then accelerated to 105% by February 2026, before the current war even began in earnest. The central bank had issued its largest ever currency denomination, the 10 million rial note, in a desperate attempt to keep enough physical cash in circulation. To understand what that means, a decade ago, a 10 million rial note would have been worth approximately $250. Today, it buys you less than $8. And against this backdrop, the NCRI reported on April 29, 2026, that a tray of eggs in Tehran now sells for approximately 600,000 tomans, around 20,000 tomans per egg. A kilogram of packaged sugar that cost 95,000 tomans in late March had reached 125,000 tomans just weeks later. Families in Iran's major cities are making choices between selling assets and buying food. The government's response, as reported by Iran International, was to allow citizens to purchase essentials on credit, backed against future subsidies. Tehran is mortgaging tomorrow's welfare payments just to keep shops open today. This is the foundation on which the war's economic pressure is now piling, not a shock absorber of surplus wealth and robust institutions. A foundation that was already cracking before the first bomb fell. Now let's go into the banking sector, because this is where the collapse becomes structural, where the choices the clerical elite made over decades are most clearly exposed, and where the damage is most likely to be permanent. Banks are the circulatory system of any economy. When they work, money flows, credit extends, businesses plan, workers get paid. When they fail, every sector seizes up simultaneously. The most dramatic illustration of how deep the rot goes is the story of Bank Ayande. In late 2025, Bank Ayande, one of Iran's major private lenders, was shut down. Its deposits and debts, totaling approximately 2.5 quadrillion rials, roughly $5 billion at prevailing exchange rates, were transferred to Bank Melli, the country's largest state-owned bank. On the surface, that sounds like a rescue. In practice, it was a warning flare. The cause of Ayande's collapse tells you exactly how the Iranian financial system actually operates. The bank had become notorious for insider lending, channeling depositor money into politically connected projects that were never going to generate real returns. It poured billions into prestige ventures, including the development of Iran Mall in Tehran, marketed as the largest shopping mall in the world. A monument to ambition, built with borrowed money, in a sanctioned economy increasingly unable to support the consumer spending the mall depended on. To attract those deposits in the first place, it offered interest rates above official regulatory limits, a classic structure where new money is continuously needed to service old obligations. By the time it collapsed, its liabilities had grown to a scale that made it one of the largest financial failures in Iranian history. The regime's response was revealing. Rather than restructure the failed institution, impose losses on creditors and shareholders, and force accountability, the standard international approach to bank failures, it simply shifted the liabilities onto the state's largest lender. The losses did not disappear. The pressure moved from one failing institution onto Bank Melli, weakening it while creating the illusion of stability. Covering those losses required money creation. The central bank printed, and that printing exacerbated inflation already running above 45%. It was not just Ayande. Multiple other banks, SEPA, Malat, Day, and Iran Zamin, are under serious strain, each carrying balance sheets bloated with non-performing loans to state enterprises and politically connected borrowers who were never held accountable. SEPA is particularly notable for its structural ties to the IRGC. It is not just a commercial lender. It is an operational node in the Revolutionary Guard's financial architecture. If an institution like that falters, as the Council on Foreign Relations noted in its January 2026 assessment, the damage does not stay within the financial sector. It propagates into the security apparatus itself. And that is the vicious cycle at the center of this story. Weak banks stop lending, businesses lose credit, production slows, prices rise further, jobs disappear, savings lose value. Citizens pull money from accounts, move it into dollars or gold or informal markets. Each individual decision is rational. Each one makes the aggregate worse. And the regime that created this system, by choosing corrupt insiders over reform, by protecting elite wealth over depositor confidence, is now watching the consequences unfold with almost no tools left to manage them. Now here is where the story moves from painful to extraordinary. While ordinary Iranians were standing in lines for subsidized bread and watching their life savings dissolve, a parallel economy was thriving, just not in Iran. In March 2026, a Times of London investigation uncovered what it described as an overseas real estate portfolio linked to the Khamenei family, worth an estimated $138 million, including properties in London's Kensington neighborhood, acquired in 2014 and 2016. A Los Angeles Today investigation into the phenomenon Iranians call Agazadeh, meaning the privileged children of the elite, documented how the families of IRGC commanders and ruling clerics have built lavish lives in Western cities, while publicly denouncing Western influence and imposing strict Islamic codes on the population they govern. Khosrow Arabi, who leads IRGC research at United Against Nuclear Iran, described the system directly. The Islamic regime in Iran is fundamentally corrupt. While regime clerics and IRGC leaders aggressively impose Islamic values on Iranian society and spread anti-American sentiment globally, their offspring enjoy opulent lifestyles in Western cities, funded by illicit gains. The investigation detailed a three-tiered pipeline for moving money out of Iran. Students and academics with IRGC connections, business figures with unexplained wealth, and regime insiders explicitly granted permission to transfer large sums abroad in exchange for supporting the regime's financial networks. This is the same system that spent over $16 billion funding Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and the Assad regime in Syria. While hospitals faced shortages, teachers went unpaid, and infrastructure crumbled. Hezbollah alone received close to $700 million per year. Hamas received approximately $100 million. The Syrian intervention consumed billions in military aid, oil shipments, and credit lines over more than a decade. The Houthis received hundreds of millions to sustain their missile and drone programs. From the regime's perspective, this was strategic investment. Those groups gave Iran power beyond its borders, leverage in negotiations, pressure on rivals, and the ability to project strength even as the domestic economy deteriorated. If Iran is powerful in the region, the argument went, the clerics are justified in their rule. But that calculus had a fatal flaw. It worked only as long as oil revenues were sufficient to fund both the proxy network and a domestic economy stable enough to keep the population from revolution. Sanctions tightened the oil revenues. The war finished the job. And now, as U.S. Treasury press releases confirm, American authorities have sanctioned Iranian officials, IRGC-linked financial networks, and, for the first time, digital asset exchanges linked to Iranian oil money laundering operations. The overseas financial architecture that protected clerical wealth is being dismantled institution by institution. As Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated formally, rather than build a prosperous Iran, the regime has chosen to squander what remains of the nation's oil revenues on nuclear weapons development, missiles, and terrorist proxies around the world. The foreign cushion is cracking, and without it, the regime is forced to lean entirely on a hollowed-out domestic economy whose remaining tools, currency intervention, money printing, budget shuffling, subsidy manipulation, have been visibly exhausted. Now let's talk about the population. Because they are not a passive backdrop to this collapse. They are an active force whose patience, already tested beyond any reasonable limit, is approaching a breaking point. The protests that swept all 31 of Iran's provinces beginning in late December 2025, documented by the House of Commons Library and extensively covered by Iran International, did not begin because of the war. They began because the rial was collapsing and food prices had become unmanageable. Shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar shuttered their stores. Students took to campuses. Workers marched in cities across the country. And then something happened that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Protesters in the clerical stronghold of Qom, the spiritual center of Iranian Shi'ism, normally among the most regime-loyal cities in the country, were openly chanting for the downfall of the theocracy. GIS reports documented in January 2026 that demonstrators were calling, "Long live the Shah, long live the monarchy, no Lebanon, no Gaza, we shall sacrifice ourselves for Iran." Pro-monarchy slogans dominating protests in the Islamic Republic is not a minor development. It reflects a generational shift in the nature of dissent, from demands for reform within the system to demands for the replacement of the system itself. Cheyenne Sammy, a former U.S. government official, told Iran International they are upset because the value of their currency has gone down the drain. But that currency collapse is not separate from the political system. It is a product of it, and the protesters knew it. The regime's response was what the CFR described as a bloody suppression of mass protests in early 2026. The European Union designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization, partially in response to that crackdown. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned Iranian officials specifically responsible for organizing the violence, including Interior Minister Eskandar Momeni Kalagari, whose security forces were documented using live fire on demonstrators. Children were among the dead in Tehran province, according to Treasury's own designation documents. And yet, despite all of that repression, the protests did not stop. They continued. And the war made conditions worse, not better. More than 120,000 Iranian students are now studying abroad, a number that has doubled in just 4 years. Doctors, engineers, and technology workers are leaving in record numbers. Over 4 million Iranians now live outside the country. Surveys show that 6 out of every 10 university graduates dream of leaving. The regime is not just losing money, it is losing its future. The generation that should be starting businesses, running hospitals, and rebuilding the country is building new lives in Europe, Canada, and the Gulf, in places that do not shoot people for asking too many questions. Now let's bring all of this back to the IRGC soldiers selling intelligence for cash. Because that detail is not an anecdote. It is the clearest signal available that the regime's enforcement mechanism is compromising from within. The clerical rulers of Iran built their power on 2 foundations: ideology and money. Ideology gave them divine authority. Money gave them the tools to enforce it. Loyalists rewarded, security forces paid, proxy militias funded, subsidies distributed just generously enough to prevent revolution. That system worked for decades, as long as the money kept flowing. The money is no longer flowing in adequate quantities, and the consequences of that are now visible inside the security apparatus itself. The IRGC has simultaneously been sidelining civilian leadership and experiencing internal financial stress. As Euronews reported in April 2026, drawing on ISW assessments, Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Arachi cannot make significant decisions without IRGC approval. IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi is reportedly making military and political decisions alongside new Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei. The structure is shifting from a cleric-dominated system to an IRGC-centric power architecture, even as the soldiers within that architecture are taking second jobs and, in documented cases, selling intelligence to survive. This is the vicious irony at the heart of the regime's current situation. The IRGC is consolidating political power at exactly the moment its financial foundation is most compromised. It is acquiring control of a sinking ship. History offers uncomfortable reference points for where this leads. In Romania, in December 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu's regime appeared stable from the outside, until it suddenly was not. The precise moment of collapse came when the army refused to continue firing on civilians in Timișoara and Bucharest. Within days of that refusal, Ceausescu was arrested. Within a week, he was dead. The entire structure collapsed not because the ideology failed, but because the instruments of enforcement stopped being reliable. In Libya in 2011, Muammar Gaddafi's control unraveled once the financial and military networks that bought tribal loyalty fractured under external pressure and oil field seizures. The structural cause was that Gaddafi's system had become too dependent on continuous cash flows to maintain the loyalty architecture that replaced genuine popular support. In both cases, the collapse did not come slowly. It came when the security forces looked at the protesters in the streets, looked at the order to fire, and made a different calculation. Iran is not Romania in 1989. The IRGC is larger, more internally coherent, and more economically embedded than Ceausescu's Securitate. The Washington Post's March 2026 reporting on U.S. intelligence assessments concluded that, despite withering airstrikes, the regime is consolidating power rather than collapsing, though in a form more dependent on the IRGC and more hardline than before the war. GIS reports analysts noted correctly in January 2026 that several elements necessary for systemic change are still absent. No unifying opposition figure has emerged. No significant military defections have occurred. Demonstrations involve thousands rather than millions, but the trajectory matters as much as the current state, and the trajectory is unmistakably negative for the regime's financial foundations. The foreign reserve cushion has fallen from over $120 billion a decade ago to somewhere between $20 and $30 billion today, a collapse of more than 80%. Oil revenues that once covered 80% of government spending have been cut to a fraction of that by sanctions and blockade. The money supply expansion of more than 40% in 2021 and subsequent years has fed an inflationary spiral the government cannot reverse without stopping money creation entirely, which would mean stopping the salary payments that keep the IRGC loyal and the subsidies that keep the population from boiling over. Every tool the regime has left makes the underlying problem worse. Printing money feeds inflation. Cutting subsidies triggers protests. Reducing IRGC salaries risks the loyalty of the security forces. Raising taxes on a population already at its limit triggers more unrest. The regime has run out of politically acceptable options. When the war eventually ends, the reconstruction bill will arrive for a population that has been carrying this weight for years. The government responsible for delivering reconstruction, or failing to, will be the same government that chose proxy militias over hospitals, printed money to cover insider lending losses, moved family wealth to Kensington while issuing 10 million rial notes to keep ATMs stocked, and used live ammunition on protesters who asked for bread. The proxy network that consumed over $16 billion is already showing the effects of the financial squeeze. Hezbollah is struggling to pay salaries. Houthi drone stockpiles are depleting. Iraqi militias are withdrawing from operations because funding has dried up. The regional influence that justified in the regime's own internal calculus decades of domestic sacrifice, that influence is eroding in real time as the money that bought it disappears. And the foreign financial architecture that allowed clerical wealth to be protected abroad is being dismantled institution by institution by U.S. Treasury sanctions targeting the digital asset exchanges and financial networks that facilitated the movement of oil money out of Iran and into real estate in Kensington and bank accounts in Dubai. What the post-war period looks like depends on two variables that are genuinely uncertain. First, whether the terms of any peace agreement provide meaningful economic relief to the civilian economy, rather than simply to the IRGC-controlled sectors that would capture any reconstruction funding first. Second, whether the economic pressure eventually creates fissures within the security apparatus itself, or whether the IRGC's grip on power tightens to the point of completely displacing civilian governance. What is not uncertain is the baseline, a 6.1% economic contraction projected for 2026, inflation at 68.9%, a currency at 1.32 million rials to the dollar and falling, a banking system absorbing concealed losses from insider lending that spans decades, a proxy network being defunded in real time, a diaspora of 4 million people who have already voted with their feet, and a domestic population that reached the clerical stronghold of calm and chanted for the end of the theocracy before the war even began. The clerics, as this war makes unmistakably clear, did not govern Iran. They extracted it. They ran one of the world's most resource-rich nations as a patronage machine for insiders, while its citizens stood in lines for bread. Its best and brightest packed their degrees and left, and its own soldiers quietly sold intelligence because their salaries no longer covered the rent. The battlefield may go quiet, but the financial collapse will continue to roar. And that collapse will test whether a regime that has survived sanctions, protests, assassinations, proxy wars, currency crises, and now a U.S.-Israeli air campaign can survive the one thing it never adequately prepared for: running out of money. I'm Flash America. If this gave you the real picture of what is happening inside Iran's financial collapse, the layer beneath the military headlines, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. This story is moving faster than any news cycle can keep up with, and I'm going to track every development. Drop your question in the comments. Do you think the Iranian regime can survive the financial reckoning that comes after the war, or is the collapse already too far advanced to reverse, regardless of what happens at the negotiating table? I'll see you in the next one.